Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're moving past the headlines and wading into the documentation behind the messy, often complex world of workplace disputes. Specifically, what happens when you're facing discrimination or unfair treatment but feel, too overwhelmed or maybe under-resourced to fight back.
Yeah, it's a tough spot for many people.
Our source material takes us deep into the specialized field of non-lawyer support in Australia. We're focusing on the Australian Workplace Discrimination Representatives, or AWDR. We've sort of synthesized their operational model, how they handle claims, and crucially, some really detailed case summaries showing, well, the hard consequences for employers who don't treat their staff fairly.
Right. And our mission today is really to dissect the function of these non-lawyer workplace specialists. They promise this unique pathway to justice. So we need to analyze the specific mechanisms they use, representation, negotiation strategy, and understand that critical difference between their approach and, say, traditional legal representation.
Mhm.
What are the implications in these recent rulings?
And the sources really hammer this home. Most employees just aren't aware of their full rights under the Fair Work Act or equal opportunity laws. You're up against a big corporate HR machine, maybe. Often people just suffer in silence. So today's discussion is about the accessible strategies out there to stop that silence.
Exactly. Finding a way through the system.
Okay, let's unpack this operational setup then. When we talk about AWDR, who exactly are these guys? They explicitly brand themselves as Australia's leading non-lawyer representatives. Over 30 years, they say. But what's the practical trade-off? Choosing a specialist like this instead of a traditional law firm.
Well, I think the trade-off is essentially scope versus speed and cost. They are workplace relations specialists. That means they focus entirely on specific channels: representation, negotiation, mediation, arbitration, mostly within the Fair Work Commission, the FWC, and state tribunals.
Okay.
The key distinction, and it's central for their whole model, is that they do not give formal legal advice. They're not engaging in that high-cost, often lengthy civil court litigation.
So their expertise is really in navigating the fair work system specifically, which arguably is where most of these workplace disputes actually end up anyway, right?
Precisely, yeah. They're aiming for the quickest, most focused resolution possible within that framework. And this specialized approach lets them handle complex stuff efficiently, like general protection disputes. That's when you exercise a workplace right, maybe take sick leave or make a complaint.
And then the employer retaliates.
Exactly. That retaliation is often called adverse action. Improving that connection, well, that takes deep knowledge of the FWC rules. That's their playground, so to speak.
Their accessibility promise seems pretty vital too. Available 24/7, servicing everywhere, major cities, rural areas. And then there's the affordability part.
Yeah.
That no-win, no-fee option for unfair dismissal and sexual harassment claims. Sounds great, but are there limitations, hidden conditions you need to watch out for?
That's a really important question. Look, no win, no fee definitely lowers the immediate barrier, that's clear. But the underlying agreement is structured differently. It means they have to believe the claim has a really high chance of success, specifically within the FWC system.
Ah, okay. So they're selective based on that system.
Right. Their success relies on being efficient negotiators, knowing when to settle for something that meets the client's needs, rather than pushing for a long, uncertain court battle. It's an efficient, focused path for things like unfair dismissal, bullying, even non-genuine redundancy claims. But it's deliberately kept within that tribunal mechanism.
So they're kind of designed to be the fast experience guide through what can be a pretty overwhelming system for most people.
Absolutely. They're there to translate all that jargon, adverse action, general protection disputes into actual steps, giving employees, a fighting chance against corporate HR departments that are often just focused on managing liability.
Right. Let's get into some of those specifics then. Here's where the actual outcomes start to define the lines. The boundaries of acceptable workplace conduct. Let's look at a case that shows how even subtle discrimination can have serious fallout. Horenberg v. State of Queensland.
Yeah, this case is a perfect example of how intent doesn't really matter when the impact is discriminatory. It involved a project costing officer, Nikki Horenberg. She repeatedly called her German colleague Helga, that wasn't her name, obviously, and used phrases like 9-9 behind her back. This wasn't just a one-off. It led to multiple formal complaints.
And the investigation found this was actual misconduct under the Public Sector Act. She got a formal reprimand, ordered into training, but then she appealed, claiming it wasn't fair because the report was redacted and she felt it should have just been handled as like a minor performance thing.
Exactly. That distinction, performance versus misconduct, that was the core of her appeal.
But the commission, They were completely clear, unequivocal. They upheld the sanction. They stated flat out that using Helga was racial stereotyping, used in a mocking way. It was disrespectful, crossed the line into serious misconduct.
What really stands out to me there is the commission saying she showed a troubling lack of insight. She maybe thought it was just office banter.
Right.
But the tribunal saw it as actionable racism.
Precisely, and that's a key takeaway for you, the listener. Tribunals are increasingly shutting down that, oh, I didn't mean it that way, defense, when the actions themselves rely on racial tropes or stereotypes. And out about the redacted report, the commission said, look, those redactions were necessary. You have to protect the privacy of the people who made the complaints. Procedural fairness doesn't trump protecting complainants. Okay, so that case shows verbal mockery gets disciplined harshly. Now let's shift to retaliation, which can be even more damaging in some ways. Dismissal by attrition, where you're basically fired without a formal letter. This is the Miss Adriana Permis v. Guzman y Gomez case. Casual crew member, her shifts just dried up after she filed a racial discrimination complaint.
Textbook adverse action, really.
Yeah.
Permis was working regularly right up until July 2024. As soon as she filed her complaint about discrimination and how work was allocated, bang, the manager stopped scheduling her. GYG denied discrimination, tried to argue performance issues, but they had nothing. No documentation to back it up.
And the personal cost. Permis told the Fair Work Commission it left her feeling so depressed and worthless. Meanwhile, she wasn't just saying she was good. She had 11 witness statements, colleagues calling her reliable, a hard worker. The company's claims just fell apart against that evidence.
Which is exactly why the FWC found no valid reason for dismissal. But here's the really critical part, I think, for corporate accountability. The commission looked closely at the conduct of GYG's own internal HR specialists. Their involvement. It was found to have had an adverse impact.
Hang on, adverse? How wasn't HR supposed to be sorting this out?
Well, it seems they actually made it worse. The HR specialists, maybe prioritizing liability management over fairness, they just left Permis in limbo. They didn't officially fire her, no termination letter, but they also refused to give her any shifts. The FWC found this corporate negligence, this failure to act professionally, especially with a young workforce, caused significant harm. They failed their duty of care, basically, by creating confusion while making it impossible for her to earn a living.
Wow. So the bottom line wasn't just about the initial complaint, but about how the company handled it.
Yes. It led to a direct financial penalty for that negligence. The FWC ordered Guzman y Gomez to pay Mrs. Permis $10,252.35. That's 26 weeks' earnings. It's a substantial penalty, really designed to punish the company for messing up the process so badly.
The stakes are clearly high in Australian tribunals, then. And looking at the sources, this push for accountability isn't just happening here, is it? We see similar, sometimes even bigger penalties globally. It suggests these oversight failures are, well, a worldwide issue. Let's look at the United Airlines case in the U.S.
Yeah, that one was pretty severe. It involved a Mongolian-American worker at a catering facility. He faced months of racial slurs being called Chinaman, and then it escalated dramatically. A manager, during a mask check, allegedly used a slur, twisted his arm, threatened him, physical abuse.
And the company's internal response, it sounds shocking. The worker quit because he felt totally unsupported.
Yeah.
And the manager involved actually got a pay raise while they were supposedly investigating, then was allowed to just retire in lieu of termination, avoided being formally fired.
An absolutely abysmal internal process. And that's precisely what triggered the massive external consequence. United Airlines had to pay the former worker US $99,000, that's around AU $148,000 plus 75,000 flight miles. But it wasn't just the money. United was also forced to overhaul its policies. They now mandate that any investigation into physical violence or threats has to start within 72 hours. That mandatory policy change, that came directly from external pressure from the settlement.
And linking this back, we also saw that U.S. case of the teacher in Georgia dismissed for writing the N-word on a whiteboard during some kind of classroom word game. The reaction was that this was just a clear violation of civil rights.
It really highlights the same core issue we saw back in the Helga case, doesn't it? Intent versus impact. The teacher might argue it was instructional, part of the game, whatever. But using a slur with that kind of history, a historically violent and dehumanizing slur, it just creates a hostile environment, full stop. Whether it's that subtle mockery in Queensland or explicit abuse in the U.S., the trend seems clear. Tribunals and authorities are increasingly focused on the actual harm caused, not just the claimed intent of the person doing it.
Right, makes sense.
So when we circle back and look at these final outcomes, the policy changes forced on United, the big payout from GYG, the formal reprimand in the Queensland case, They all show that these specialized non-lawyer representatives, they fulfill a critical function. They take an employee's experience, maybe subtle discrimination, maybe corporate negligence, and translate it into findings that force real consequences. Financial compensation, yes, but also structural changes sometimes. They offer that focused expertise purely on getting some kind of redress.
Yeah, they seem driven by that commitment to make sure employees actually get supported against unfair practices. They provide that crucial, accessible channel for justice that, let's face it, an individual often just can't navigate on their own against a big company.
Which brings us to a final, maybe a provocative question for you, the listener. Considering how incredibly complex it can be to fight a large employer and the sheer cost barrier of traditional law firms, how much does the speed, the specialized focus, and the affordability of this kind of non-lawyer representation actually influence whether someone decides to fight for justice, or whether they just endure the unfairness and ultimately walk away in silence?